The Messerschmitt 264 is surrounded by an aura, which can be traced back to the fact that it is seen as a clear indication of Hitlerian delusions, a regime that seriously felt it could take World War II to the four corners of the world, and in the form of the Messerschmitt 264, begin routine air raids against the US Eastern Seaboard and beyond.
That was Dr. Klaus Schmider. He teaches at the Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst and wrote this book, Hitler's Fatal Miscalculation, why Germany declared war on the United States. He looked extensively at the strategic rationale of Germany's declaration of war against the US following the Japanese raid on Pearl Harbor, and part of that story is connected to this aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me 264, popularly known as the Amerikabomber. In the years following the Second World War, quite a few myths, assumptions and what-if scenarios have been attached to the Me 264, but few of them stand up to rigorous inspection, especially once you actually start delving into the German archives and you start reading those original sources. So welcome to Military Aviation History. My name is Chris, and in this video I will talk about the Me 264, what Germany's plans really were with these aircraft, whether the Me 264 was in fact a realistic project, and then I'm going to be addressing the what-if scenario. And all of that is coming at you sponsored by War Thunder. Let's briefly discuss what the Messerschmitt Me 264 was. The Me 264 was a 4-engine heavy bomber of the German Luftwaffe. Development started in the late 1930s, but by early 1941 only a handful of prototypes had been ordered. In total, only 3 prototypes were then built, with a reported range of about 8,500 kilometers with a 6-ton bomb load. As so often, it is likely that in operational terms this bomb load would actually have to be decreased in order to achieve this range. The Me 264 has been caught in a flight of fancy. This is no surprise really. The popular name of Amerikabomber sets it up for that. And there are 2 sides to this. The first side is to just take the Wunderwaffle approach, as I like to call it, and see in the Me 264 a what-if scenario of German air dominance, creating these images of German bomber formations that fly over New York. We see the Empire State Building engulfed by a city in flames, the Statue of Liberty is out there in the harbor surrounded by all this inferno. I think you're starting to sort of get the mental picture here that's being built up. But on the other hand, there are also those that have called the Me 264 an irrational vanity project that just showed that the German leadership had basically completely lost their touch with realism.
Previous historians have made a big deal of this. To them, the very idea of a bomber that might be able to reach the eastern seaboard and beyond just indicates the actions and the designs of a regime that is clearly, well, out to lunch, colloquially speaking, and that it really is indulging in fantasies. The problem is that the story behind the Messerschmitt 264 does not really reflect this.
Then what was Germany's plan with the 264? Well, a very long-range bomber would allow for the application of air power in multiple ways. But the initial conception of it was to provide Germany with a symbolic means of deterrence against the US.
A 1942 letter from Claude Dornier, whose company was briefly under consideration to take over the project, basically reminded a fellow production manager that the original idea behind the Messerschmitt 264 was a blend of propaganda and deterrence. It was really supposed to be an aircraft for a PR stunt. A handful of prototypes was supposed to be ready in time to intimidate the Americans into staying out of the war. 3 or 4 Messerschmitt 264s should have soared through the skies of Boston or New York, dropping leaflets and impress on the Americans their supposed vulnerability to this new strategic air threat. I have not been able to find a shred of evidence that a serious bombing campaign involving the Messerschmitt 264 was at any point contemplated, even in passing.
As such, the Me-264 had a certain urgency up to December 41, though it definitely was not a priority. However, with the declaration of war against the US by Hitler, the reasons for its existence had essentially become moot. Now, the question emerges whether a plane that was mainly designed for a PR stunt could actually be used in a kinetic application with bombs. I mean, we've seen the Germans retrofit a Focke-Wulf 200, which was an airliner, into a military aircraft, and that didn't really go that well. So that already shows you some issues here. But what had happened in end of 1941 and early 1942, that the so-called Amerikabomber project was launched, where the German Air Ministry put out a proposal for a long-range bomber that could strike the United States. And the Me-264 became connected to that program because it had the paper qualities the Luftwaffe was looking for. However, as we will see, the Amerikabomber project as a whole, as well as the Me-264 specifically, they were never seriously prioritized by the Luftwaffe. What we can gather from the remaining primary sources on the Me-264 indicates that the complexities of this project were very well known in Germany at the time. The resources required to build, as well as the amount of fuel required to operate even a single machine, plus the additional problems with the aircraft's considerable basing requirements, maintenance and logistics, all impressed on the Luftwaffe leadership that the costs of this project stood in no relation to its benefits as a war-fighting piece of kit.
What is left in the company archives and the records of the German Air Ministry basically indicates a project which was not given a high priority to begin with, then was prioritized with a view to reaching the United States, but in ever-decreasing numbers. Initially, the 100 aircraft were to be produced, then 50, then barely a dozen, because wartime priorities would not allow for anything else. And then finally, the indications were that the Messerschmitt 264 would actually struggle to reach New York or Washington with a useful bomb load in any case. So the project was retained in 1941 for the very simple reason that nobody envisaged a Geschwader, never mind 2 or 3, to take to the skies. The priority was to have 3 or 4 prototypes that could be sent into American airspace for what would have amounted to a publicity stunt. A publicity stunt with a clear tinge of menace attached.
The question might now arise. What if the Me-262 was available to Germany in sufficient numbers to field a full Kampfgeschwader, so a bomber wing or a bomber group, depending on if you're US or UK? At this point, we jump straight into the fairy tale country of make-believe and pretense, but as you know, I'm actually not a fan of these historical what-ifs because of 3 reasons. Firstly, usually historical what-if scenarios just indulge in the specific fantasy of the person that is actually behind the what-if, and well, that's not going to go far. Second, the practical complexities of the scenarios that are often built up are completely underplayed, especially in terms of all the factors, the different factors beyond the actual equipment that is being put available. So basing, training, maintenance, logistics, and all those things, those are typically ignored in these scenarios. And third, adversary countermeasures and adaptation are also often downplayed or not considered at all. In sum, this often causes what-if scenarios to appear far more effective or far more conclusive than they would have likely been. Nevertheless, let us look at this in terms of operational strength, basing and fuel to have an indication if it was realistic for Germany to fly missions in 1943, let's say late 1943, against America, which is the earliest a full Me-264 Kampfgeschwader would have even gotten remotely close to being ready for this sort of mission if they had been given a high priority for production and then also retraining and so on and so forth in early 1942. And just to spoil this already, no, it's not realistic. But talking about what ifs and operational 264s, you can in fact fly one in War Thunder. Experience bombastic air, land and naval battles in War Thunder, which is completely free to play and features more than 2,000 playable aircraft and helicopters. And yes, then there are also those unimportant targets known as tanks and ships. You can experience flying the most legendary World War II era aircraft and then transition into the Cold War and even contemporary jets. And the Me-264 is one of those aircraft that you can fly. In fact, the footage you've been seeing throughout this video already comes straight out of the game. Of course, you can also drive tanks and ships in War Thunder's popular mixed battle experience. But really, you just do that to then jump in a plane and deliver close air support. Like, would you really drive around in a target all day? Now, War Thunder is constantly adding new tanks, ships, and of course, the most important of all, new aircraft in continuous updates, and the game features full cross-platform integration between PC, PlayStation and Xbox. Sign up for free and get a sign-up bonus with a free premium vehicle, boosters and an exclusive channel logo. All you need to do for that flying start, pun intended, is to hit up that link in the description below and you're off to a flying start. In 1943, a German Kampfgeschwader had a nominal strength of 93 aircraft at Geschwader level. In terms of crews, we are talking about 340 aircrew and 320 support personnel. To be clear, Germany rarely achieved this nominal strength in their Geschwaders by 1943, even before that. So I'm going to admit a reserve recon transport aircraft for a Kampfgeschwader that it should normally have here as well. With that caveat, we can assume that roughly 100 aircraft and about 1,000 men would cover the demand of a Kampfgeschwader. And yes, this does include the Geschwader's own personnel, as well as that of all the different air bases that assist with the stockpiling, the maintenance and the repairs that this Geschwader is being based at. And of course the operational running of the bombers that was also supported by that kind of staff. However, in this calculation, we are basing ourselves on medium bombers, as Germany mainly relied on such types. Heinkel 111s or something like that. An Me-264 would require a substantial increase in supporting personnel. This places us in front of a very unrealistic proposition, which I will now demonstrate. First, let's draw on a very heavy bombardment group of the United States using B-29s as an example. It is a comparable state-of-the-art 4-engine machine, giving us a roughly equal crew and maintenance requirement. A group required around 2,000 men for 45 aircraft. This provides a reference figure for our German case. And the question is now, where does Germany get these men from in 1943? Now suppose aircrew and personnel that was already on the ground can be sourced from other Geschwaders and efficiently and effectively retrained. Well, the equivalent of about 50 Me-264s requires more than 2 full Kampfgeschwaders of medium bombers, which, considering the lowish operational strength of the Luftwaffe in 1943, would have been closer to 3 Geschwaders. So in essence, to gain 50 Me-264s, Germany would have to give up at least 200 combat aircraft, which I would argue provide actually a much more significant contribution to the Luftwaffe's operation in the end of 1943 than the Me-264 would have done. We can see the difficulties of fielding such a force for the Luftwaffe by looking at Kampfgeschwader 40. This unit used the 4-engine Focke-Wulf 200 and the 4-engine twin-engine looking Heinkel 177 against Allied shipping, and this unit did in fact have a high priority in 43. In December 43, they boasted about 58 Focke-Wulf 200s and 26 Heinkel 177s, of which only 21 and 16 were operational respectively. This had only been achieved through a dedicated effort, yet reports indicate that this unit consistently suffered from deficiencies in training and operational know-how in its crew and ground personnel. Now, the second element I want to look at here is basing. Where do you put all these Me-264s to fly out? Suppose the aim is to strike at America. The reported range of the Me-264 puts the plane in range of America on the Atlantic coast. Though in 1940 the Germans looked at using the Canary Islands as a staging ground, after somehow convincing Franco to join the Axis. By the way, there is a theory out there that the Azores could have been used, or were being planning to be used, if Portugal could have been convinced. However, to my knowledge, there is no credible primary source that indicates that the Azores were in fact discussed in this on any sort of particular level, nor was it realistic, as in 1943 Portugal then agreed to provide access to the Allies, and as such I'm going to completely ignore this option. In any case, a deployment of Me-264s in France in 1943 would have placed them in the same peril as it did KG-40 with the Focke-Wulf 200s and Heinkel 177s, namely in frankly quite easy bombing range from the UK and having to face a heavily patrolled Bay of Biscay. And we all know how difficult KG-40 had it by this time. I have a video on that right here. And let's just assume even one or two Me-264s would have flown over to the Atlantic and dropped something, even if it's leaflet or a bomb, on the United States. I think the response of the 8th Air Force that was stationed in the UK would have essentially been to completely obliterate whatever airfield they were using in France. So that's not necessarily realistic. An island option in the Canaries does exist. This is just like the Azores theory, but a little bit more tangible in terms of the evidence that we have for it. This could have been an option, but it was also not very realistic. First off, Germany would have to invest a lot of resources to get the island ready for Me-264 operations, including the building and extension of existing airfields and the existing infrastructure. Second, it would have to guarantee a constant stream of supplies, either by sea or air, including a lot of precious fuel that is being brought in plus burned in order to get in. Third, it would have to build air and sea defenses, station a fighter protection unit, and also deploy ground troops to guard against Allied raids or seaborne invasions. And then fourth, the position of the Canaries gave Germany very few options to resupply the island with men and material in case it is attacked. And fifth, the position of the island makes it very vulnerable to naval bombardment or an Allied carrier task force going on one of their famous drive-bys. And beyond that, let's not forget that in late 1943, Gibraltar is right here, North Africa is squarely in Allied hands, the Kriegsmarine is bottled in, and the Allies are already driving up the boot of Italy. So really, this was only a somewhat realistic idea in 1940, and calling it realistic back then is already a stretch. Also, if you want to look at sort of the problems that Germany would have had in order to actually get supplies to the Canaries during this time, look no further than the attempted resupply of the remainders of the Afrika Corps in Tunisia in early 1943. I mean, the Allies essentially had a Turkish route right there. Then finally, let's consider fuel. Germany had already gone through a fuel crisis in 1942, and the Me-264 with its 24,000 liters of max internal fuel, 24,000 liters of fuel. That is the max fuel load of quick maths 60 Bf-109s, or roughly 3 to 4 Heinkel 111s. Because usually they don't fly it with full fuel, they just fly with enough fuel to finish a mission, plus some contingency. I think you're starting to see the point where I'm getting at, but let's look at this closely. Let's have a look at the fuel cycle duration here. We can see how in 1942 the fuel consumption of the Luftwaffe started to jump ahead of production. After a brief stabilization in 1943, the same occurs again. A big thank you here to engineer Callum Douglas for providing this easy-to-use reference data from his book, The Secret Horsepower Race. You can get it for 10% off at Morton's with my discount code. Now, one can say that fuel is available for whatever plane would use it, right? The question here is what worth the fuel has in a single Me-264 versus the same amount of fuel within another aircraft. Or to put it more clearly, what does Germany gain out of fueling up a single Me-264 versus say 3 to 6 Heinkel 111s at half fuel loads? During this time, the Luftwaffe was able to scrape by, but it had to consistently temper the number of bomber operational sorties by balancing out available fuel stocks against operational requirements. For example, in 1943, there was that one final high-intensity air interdiction campaign flown on the Eastern Front. And combat mass here was generated through a lot of medium bombers flying bombing missions at short enough ranges that provided enough airframes carrying enough bombs with a not too prohibitive fuel expenditure. Especially if one was shot down and you lose not just the plane and of course the crew, but also the fuel. At the same time, the reliance on medium bombers here still allowed bombers on other front lines to fly as well. If a smaller number of Me-264s were in service instead, the cost per airframe of flying these missions would raise to such a degree and to such a cost and decrease the overall combat mass across all theaters that they are no longer a worthwhile investment if we ignore the fact that basing was already a problem and of course that you were not really able to get the men and the personnel for this. To sum up, the Me-262 was a project of deterrence that, due to its specifications, was then transferred to the so-called Amerikabomber project. However, this project was then never really pushed forward with any sort of prioritization because the complexities of this project were very well known. And even if we were to consider the possibility that, say, a number of 50 to 100 aircraft would have been built, then Germany would have very few air bases from where they could realistically operate these bombers from, calling into question why they built them in the first place. And you would have to be hard-pressed to find the crews and the personnel that could support this infrastructure and the Geschwader in itself. And you would have to invest high stocks of aviation fuel as well, while simultaneously losing overall combat mass across basically all the theaters operations that Luftwaffe was fighting in. Big thank you here to Andrew as well as Bernhard Kast from Military History Visualized for their fire support on this video, as well as all the patrons and channel members. As always, have a great day and see you in the sky.